Well, welcome to another episode of the Grazing Sheep Podcast. I'm your host, Big Tom Perkins, along with Dr. Cameron Meyerly. And we thought maybe today we just continue our discussion with grazing, getting those sheep out on grass. I know last week I said that what I do would be considered adaptive grazing. And so we adapted to not put sheep out just quite yet because the weather just got pretty crappy.
Yeah, I know where those ewes are at there in central Ohio. We were moving some fence and rain was coming down pretty hard and they were shaking to get dry, and you felt a little bad because I knew how cold it was going to be. So I guess on that point, in terms of those daily moves, do you offer anything for shade, or with your new paddock uh, development or design, do you have any permanent or temporary ideas for shade in those daily moves?
Well, we don't have many trees. All the trees were taken off this farm years ago. So we've been using just old flatbed hay wagons and just kind of watching it sails. And I've got one wagon that kind of crabs a little sideways when you pull it. And the sheep don't seem to mind at all with that. And like I said, we'll hook a couple of those together when we've got a bigger flock, but that's pretty much all we use. And I noticed last summer we had a couple of weeks there. It was fairly hot for our area and the sun just beating down. And most of those ewes would be crammed up under that wagon. And then just throughout the day, 10 or 15 would come out and graze for a while, and then they'd come back under, and some more would go out and graze for a while, then they'd come back under. And it seems like if they could get their heads under, they're pretty happy. They don't have to get their whole body under.
Yeah, I had a discussion with a gentleman. This was a couple years ago down in New Mexico. Uh, Obviously, quite a bit warmer environment than what we deal with in this part of the
Mm-hmm.
world. But he had asked, like, how much shade do you need for a group of 100 ewes? And it's like, I didn't know it was a trick question at the time. And he
Mm-hmm.
said it takes one fence post because that sheep puts her head under that shade, and then you got a line of sheep that sit in the shade of that one ahead of them.
I believe
And
that.
of course, in part, I think he was joking. And then I also think that that's pretty accurate. I know another example. I think a lot of individuals, not that shade isn't important, but we maybe place too much emphasis on it depending on your environment or what your climate is. Had a picture sent out to a couple of friends a couple years ago, of just some ewes that nestled themselves down into some tall fescue that was pretty high, and were just laying as still as possible,
Mm-hmm.
head flat against the ground. And it's like, oh, what's wrong with you? Well, I walk up to them, they take off running.
Yeah.
Um, and what was interesting to me is there wasn't a single fly on them.
Yeah.
And so that picture I sent was captioned with, the flies don't bite if you just play dead. And
Mm-hmm.
so, and it, just fascinating to see those animals working out in that environment. Certainly, I think there's probably some more work to be done on the color side of things. We know what happens to cattle with different hide colors in
Mm-hmm.
different regions of the U.S. and some temperature differences there. But yeah, it's just interesting to watch that grazing behavior out in an open warm area.
Yeah, I was at a grazing conference. I was back in the 90s, I guess, and they were doing a study with Holsteins to see if color affected milk as far as them being out on pasture, and a lot of it had to do with the temperature. And
With red and whites versus your traditional black
no,
and
it
white
was
Holstein, or
I guess cows that were Holsteins that were more black as compared to having more white. And
gotcha.
the result of the study was that the white ones were a lot easier to find at night. That was pretty
Right.
much what they came away with.
Right.
They just couldn't find a whole lot of difference in that. But I know, like I said, with the sheep using the hay wagons, it's worked fine. Um,
So
if I
how
get
many do you think you
really,
can fit underneath one?
what's that?
How many can you fit underneath one hay wagon
If you didn't want
comfortably?
them there, you could probably get all of them under there. It's
Yeah.
I don't know. It's so we've had, I guess, maybe close to 100 ewes out with lambs, and we've used 2 hay wagons, and they didn't. No one seemed to be, crushed in the middle, kind of a thing. And as that sun kind of moves, that hay wagon starts to cast a bit more of a shade. But it was only a few hours in the afternoon, and then they just seemed to be back out grazing. And like I said, it never seemed like everybody was under it. And when it rains, the only animals that go under it are the goats. They just go under and kind of stick their heads out and watch. And behind that, we have a mineral sled that also has. We're still running 40-gallon water tubs, and we can mount 2 of those water tubs sideways on that sled. So when we pull that wagon, that sled is chained to the last wagon, and it just comes right along with it.
So you hook up one time and you move shelter, mineral water at
Yep.
one single point in the day
Yep.
and haul those over.
So we have
And
this
I
weird.
guess what
We have
time of day are you looking to move those things?
we've been moving it. I guess late in the afternoon, really for 2 different reasons. Everything I've read says that the bricks levels are the highest in those grasses in the middle of the afternoon, and so
Now,
that's,
what's a bricks level?
as far as I understand, that's the nutritional level of the sugars that are in that grass.
Yeah, a sugar measurement.
Yeah. And so that's when it's highest, is in, sometime in the afternoon, because it's had lots of time to do all that photosynthesis, I guess, is what brings that sugar level up. The other part of that too is, they just, I don't know if there's any research done on it or not, but we know parasites move in that dew level. And in the mornings, that dew is a lot thicker than it is in the afternoon or in the evenings. So we kind of feel like if we're moving then and they're coming in and doing a pretty hard graze right away, they're just not picking up as many parasites.
And they're grazing pretty hard at that afternoon move.
Oh
Would you
yeah,
say just watching behavior at that time of day, do they graze at the same intensity or speed when you move them in as what they were in that previous paddock?
it seems like it. They're just hustling through, picking all the best stuff. Sheep don't. I know with the cows, they would walk to the furthest fence and then stop, put their heads down, and start eating. And sheep, they never stand still. They just keep moving around, moving around, moving around, moving around. And it's always like, oh, that looks good. I'll eat that. Oh, look at that over there. Oh yeah. And they just kind of seem to flip from one plant to the other. And we like to tramp a lot of grass down, so that's works to that advantage as well. I don't know what happens in the morning when that dew is back on, but a good bit of that grass is fairly tramped, and you'll see them kind of spread out more in the morning, just picking here and there. But we make that move in the afternoon. I walk to one corner of that fence and yell for them to come, and they all come gathering up. You open that gate up and stand back, because here they come.
Yeah. And I guess my thought or question that maybe some other individuals are curious about. So you're trampling that grass down. So obviously we're affecting what we would see as normal growth pattern in our forage species.
Mhm.
So I could you explain a little bit on your rest periods, kind of what you're shooting for, and then maybe why that is, and also on that trampled grass, grass that you're incorporating onto that soil surface, what type of regrowth or timeline of regrowth do you see in those heavily trampled areas?
Well, I guess the second part first. It is amazing how fast that starts to regrow.
Now, do you think it's continued growth or is it new growth from plants that now have an open canopy?
It's kind of both. It was explained to me that even though that plant is tramped down, if that plant is still green, there's still photosynthesis going on. Now, maybe not as much because you've hindered some of the solar panels, but it is crazy how quickly it starts to regrow. And then that trampling down, you're feeding the biology in the soil, and you're keeping that soil covered and cool, and that makes a huge difference in it. And when you get any kind of a rain, I think even just the dew in the mornings is just so much more of it is being retained because the sun can't get down through that trampled down canopy. I think it's amazing. Now I forgot what the first part of the question was. You did too.
Yes. So your grazing intervals, so your rest periods, and what are you shooting for, and why is that?
So we're trying to get as close to 90 days as we can. A lot of people think that's entirely too long. I was at a grazing conference in Ohio this winter where the bulk of those sheep producers were all shooting for 30 days because they wanted their sheep on that regrowth. But those guys were all worming on a regular basis. And I couldn't help but think, well, yeah, because you're just constantly putting yourself right in there where you've got a massive parasite pressure. And that's part of that 90 days is we feel like there's a significant reduction in the amount of parasites that have managed to live that full 90 days. The other thing too is that the longer you can let grass grow, and grow is the important part there, because once that dies and starts into senesce, I think the bigger root structure you can get on those plants, and the bigger root structure you have, just the more vigorous regrowth you end up with.
Yeah, longevity of that
Yes.
individual plant
Mm-hmm.
certainly changes. And I guess if we explain kind of the mentality or thought process behind that 30-day graze, because again, even in that adaptive grazing or whatever you want to call the type of grazing you're involved in or you're researching, there is division within each and every one of those. And
Oh yeah.
so, those that are grazing at a 30-day interval or a even shorter interval than that, um, everybody will tell you why their method is the best. And so when we go from, I guess, the opposing argument on the 90 days is as forage matures, we lose nutritional value or digestibility because we have increased fiber content,
Yep.
predominantly as fiber that is not digestible. So our structural portions of that plant, items like lignin that
Yep.
are not highly digestible or digestible. And the thought process behind that 30-day rotation is we've allowed for regrowth. We should be coming in before the reproductive stages of that plant when that plant starts to lay down those structural contents, and we're hitting that or able to harvest that forage at a more digestible state. So ideally, we're capturing more nutrition from that plant for our livestock. Certainly if we're grazing lambs, maybe we worry a little bit more about the digestibility of that fiber. The bulk in your scenario and in a lot of my scenario, when we're grazing our grazing season, what class of animal are you grazing out on that pasture?
Yeah, that has an awful lot to do with it. For the most part, there are ewe lambs in there, and those ewe lambs are averaging about a half a pound a day
Of gain?
of gain through most of that grazing season. And that's fine. That's all I need. I don't need a whole lot more than that. they're going to max out. There's no doubt. Um, Now, if you've got, lambs that you need to send to the sale at a certain date, or you need to send to a butcher at a certain date, then maybe you need to do a 30-day rotation because you need those to gain over a half a pound a day.
Yeah, I will say on grass that, not saying it's not possible. Uh, Half a pound is exceptional. Uh, when we think of kind of average for performance on forage alone, that 0.25 to a third of a pound a day tends to
Mhm.
be, what we can see in a good grazing environment.
Yeah, the last 2 years we've been at like 0.46 and 0.47
Yeah.
pounds of gain per day.
And
And
there's a lot of things that go into that, like environmental conditions that change that average daily gain. So if I have sheep, regardless of breed, that are more susceptible to parasites, if I become heavily infected, I'm not partitioning that extra nutrition, or I don't have that additional nutrition to fight off that parasite load. Or maybe I can fight off that parasite load for survival, but I don't have the additional nutrition, those additional calories to go into growth, to meet my genetic capacity for average daily gain.
mhm.
Um, and so certainly on those ewe lambs, I'm a big advocate on developing those individuals in the environment in which we want them to thrive long term. Um, but certainly do I get concerned over forage quality on my mature ewes when they're open in a maintenance state of productivity? No, we need very little going into those sheep for them to gradually gain back body condition
Mhm.
after lactation and going into that breeding season. And honestly, if I can get them, obviously I want to be putting weight on them, but if I can keep them in a healthy body condition going into breeding, it certainly opens up some opportunity for flushing those ewes and capitalizing on some increased ovulation rates.
Yeah, I think the other thing, I started into this rotational grazing with cows. Um, and I'm sure the first year, all I was doing was rotationally overgrazing. But somewhere along the line, I kind of quit paying attention to the cows and started paying more attention to the grass, and was trying to do everything I could to make the health of that soil and those grass plants, taking that into consideration first and foremost. And what that has done is just produced a heck of a lot more grass. And now you can so you're using the animals to manage that grass while keeping an eye on the health and management of the animals. But it's you kind of have to get that grass part of it working first and kind of pay more attention to that. And you don't want animals out there dying, and you don't want them, you've got to meet an economic threshold there at some point. But my argument is you're not putting dollars into them, you're putting time. And, I've said for years, I can sit in the house and watch Oprah, or I can go out and move sheep. Uh, we get all this fence up, and there's a good possibility we'll be moving sheep twice a day.
Right. You'll still have time to watch Oprah.
And I'll still have time to watch Oprah.
Right.
Yeah. And I think, when we do that, I think we might be able to increase that half a pound to, maybe to 3/4 of a pound. I don't know, because I think they'll just constantly be on better grass. And I think the other part of this too is, when we pull those sheep off that pasture, move into the next paddock, you can reach down and pick that grass up, and it's still 6, 8, sometimes 10 inches tall. You're not they're still getting the best of what's in there. They're not they're not grazing down into the stock that's heavily lignified. I'm perfectly fine with them taking off, just leaves and just nipping the tops of things, and and I know there's a lot of talk about weeds that are in pasture, and my argument is if your sheep will eat them, they're not really weeds. Now I
Right.
know with the wagons, we've got a few spots where we still have some broom sedge, and so we tend to park those wagons right on top of those broom sedge patches. And we figure if nothing else, we're probably raising fertility there, and maybe the hoof action and so on is going to knock some of that down. Um, we had a hillside that was kind of covered in briars, and the year that I was so sick, CJ kept taking round bales and putting out there, and just letting those cows eat those round bales right where all those briars were. And there's very few briars there now, and we think we could do the same thing with sheep as well. Part of that is, I'm sure the hay is helping out in that situation, but so is just having the animals concentrated there. You're just kind of changing the biology that's in that soil right there.
Yeah, I know we've got some areas on that bale feeding or purposeful, feeding of stored forage for soil fertility purposes. We went through and cleaned out some fence rows here this spring, last fall, and had burn piles. And we
Mhm.
know what happens in those dead areas where we had to
Yeah.
burn stuff. And so didn't have a whole lot of option of where we took the piles, because I didn't want to spend all day dragging trees, half a mile away.
Hmm.
And so went into it with the thought process of, we're going to clear this ash off, get it to grade of the rest of the field. And then, we've got some compost we're going to put on, and the plans to feed round bales out on those sites, specific to where we burnt that brush material, and see what happens.
Yeah.
Just to see how quickly can we improve that soil or fertility where we know, we've had some detrimental items happen there. So a couple questions on, what you just brought up in terms of, you mentioned the gain with an additional move in a day, you feel that you can increase productivity. On the genetic side of things, I know you've shared that you're involved with NSIP and that's a value to you. What are the keys that you look for in selection for your sheep, maybe even outside of NSIP, that provides you the information to say these lambs are going to perform out on pasture, uh, when we go to rear them on a forage based diet? Uh, how do you look at that genetic selection to increase that growth out on grass?
Well, I guess one of the big things we're looking at is parasite resistance in the rams.
So reducing environmental factors.
Right. Yeah, because it's we know that parasite resistance helps not just in parasites, but just immunity to a lot of other things. They just seem to be just overall healthier lambs. Um, and we're looking for weight gain in those. We'd love to be able to find a ram that's highly parasite resistant and has a great post weaning weight EBVs in them, and then we like that yearling weight to be pretty flat because we don't want great big giant sheep. But I guess phenotypically, I'm looking for ewes with really deep bodies because they can just hold that much more forage. We don't want, we've got some with really long legs and they're not very tall. You
Yeah.
know?
But and
So
the
they just
scary
have
thing
that
is as
really
we
narrow, I don't know, in cattle, we call it depth of rib, so they just, we've got a few that just have that really narrow depth of rib and down the road, those would be some of the ones that will go for sure because they just can't get enough forage in them. Um, we do. Oh, about a month before they're going to lamb, we'll feed them on a pound of oats per head per day, just to give that extra energy in there. But I don't necessarily think you'd have to do that with those deep bodied ewes. I think they could bring enough forage in to
Yeah. And
make
one
that.
thing to think about on those deep bodied sheep, and you brought it up. I too have some some taller, more narrow built individuals when we're thinking about skeletal structure.
Mhm.
And, to look at the pen, you'd say, oh, that sheep's bigger than the one over here that's 6 inches shorter than she is. And just a animal evaluation standpoint, length and height are pretty straightforward when we're thinking two-dimensional. When we start to add that width or that depth, uh, it results in capacity.
Yeah.
And that capacity almost adds an exponential factor to weight capacity,
Hmm.
um, or what those animals weigh. So I know I have shorter, both in height and length, individuals in my flock that, again, to look at just from a two-dimensional side view, you would say, oh, they're smaller animals, but actually weigh more than those that maybe have additional air underneath them, um, just because they don't carry that width and capacity, the ability to hold weight, um, in them. So when we're thinking about body weight, the big thing is, ties into marketing, but also maintenance of that animal, what we have to feed 12 months out of the year. And so that's for our flock. Uh, I pay a lot of attention to mature body weight, because, again, she's rearing that lamb for 60 to 90 days, and I'm happy to provide the nutrition to her to assist with lactation, in rearing those lambs. But the other, however many months out of the year, I'd rather feed less to accomplish maintenance in a smaller animal than one that's much larger, requiring additional maintenance requirements, just due to body weight.
Yeah.
You know, just staying alive, requires more in those, tends to require more in those individuals.
I notice in those narrow body ewes, they will lose body conditions so much faster than those deep rib ewes. And I my guess is just because they cannot get as much in them. You have to feed I guess a higher calorie concentration of whatever they're eating. Just that, yeah, they just have to have more calories in it. Where it seems like the others, that's not such a big deal because they can take enough in of lower caloric feed, I guess.
Yeah. So if we get back to grazing here, you mentioned trample that forage down. So I'm assuming you've then reduced the need or requirement to mow after you move those sheep out of that paddock.
Yeah,
Have you
we do
ever?
very little mowing. Mowing has a lot to do with you want the place to look nice, kind of a thing. We there's pastures we haven't mowed for quite a while, and you can tell because they've got some all floor rows in, and so some of those are going to be, they'll get clipped this year and kind of, and then when we do uh, run a brush hog over them just to kind of clean them up, we're mowing pretty high. We're not down there, clipping everything. We're just knocking the stuff off that's 6 8 inches above, and that's it. When I come up to those multiple rose bushes, I kind of grab the lever and sink her right down to the dirt and pick her back up again. But you can see those patches all summer long. That grass is so much shorter, and it's just because you cut them too short. All the grass that was around that multiple rose, and I imagine it sloughed off a bunch of its roots, and therefore it has to search harder to find nutrients and moisture in each one of those individual plants. But it's yeah, we you always want the place to look nice, but I remember years ago we had a, oh, I can't remember, it was El Nino or La Nina, whatever it was, where it rained every 3 days, and we were still making hay. And I had a gal who bought about 5,000 bales of hay from us a year, and she let it be known in the community that she didn't want any hay off my farm because it was just too old looking. And but when he went out and walked through that, there was a lot of good green stuff down on the bottom. And when we went in and mowed some of those fields off to make them for hay, bales looked beautiful. And I took her some of that hay up without telling her that she came off those brown fields. She thought it looked, fantastic. But it is that, so like I said, we don't worry too much about it just being this beautiful pastoral looking, kind of a place. We just worry about more what's there when they always say you can't evaluate your field from a pickup truck. You got to get out and walk through it and see what's there. And so from a distance, you look out and you see some raggedy looking plants here and there. And it's not all uniform and not all pristine. But when you walk through it, you're like, man, there's a lot of stuff in here, a lot of good stuff growing. And
Yeah,
I
and I
think,
definitely grew up on a farm that, what you said, you're mowing because, we need to either control those weeds uh,
Mhm.
through mechanical means, and also from the road, there's value, um, looking at those
Yeah.
sites, and you want that pastoral type view. And so that was primarily, it was weed control with a lot of items, and uh,
And I'd
again,
be
didn't have
willing
a
to
lot of
bet that
sheep.
by the time most people get out and mow, those weeds have already set seed. You didn't get ahead of them.
Oh, right, right. But you can't see the ironweed once it's cut.
No.
I'm not saying it won't come back, but again, it goes back to appearance.
Hmm.
And so growing up, that was just not that we mowed after every pass, but you'd go out and clean stuff up once, maybe twice a year. And so more recently, with the expansion of the sheep side of the business, the bush hog has seen very little use.
Yeah.
And it kind of was eye opening as we started transition from those weather type sheep into a production oriented commercial flock.
Hmm.
Uh, you start to evaluate the time and maintenance on that equipment, and what that time can be spent doing other things. Uh, again, with a more rotational pattern of movement. Um, the first thing to me, I guess the convincing item was turn those ewes out, and immediately they'd go straight for the burdock
Hmm.
and cleared everything off before while it was still in a vegetative state.
Yeah.
Then we move them over to another field, and they strip the leaves of what they could reach uh, on ironweed.
Hmm.
Um, and maybe that's another discussion for another day, because I know we're running short on time here, but we've actually utilized those sheep to manage some fence rows with some very woody growth.
Hmm.
We're in the process of converting established, I guess, quote unquote, established wooded area into some silvopasture that we hope to utilize those sheep in clearing up what's remaining after we did um, some machine work down in there. But certainly it can change your opinion going from, I guess it was a learning curve for, both myself and those that are on that farm, um, that you have to change the lens in which you're looking at that grassland, that
Hmm.
pasture environment. And so it looks very different now. And I think you can find beauty or value in the view you see now, as well as that it was a different lens we looked through, um, 4 or 5 years ago. So there's always time to change that and try something different. And guess what? If we hate it and we need to mow something, the bush hog's still sitting there. It just sees very little use now.
Yep. That's the truth of it. Well, we're running up on our time here, Cam. So we thank you for listening to another episode of the Grazing Sheep Podcast. If there's something you'd like us to talk about, or you just want to reach out and get in touch with us, you can do that at bigtomperkins@gmail.com. So it's good catching up with you, Cam.
You too, Tom.
All right. We'll talk to you later.
All right. Bye.
Bye.